My heartless husband walked out on me at the charity event when I showed him the adoption papers I secretly filed to save a child. He shouted, "You're pathetic for needing a kid to feel important." But that night, when he returned home, his face went pale in fear. My name is Rena. I'm 39, and I live in Richmond, Virginia. I work in nonprofit development, the kind of job where you spend more time organizing donor luncheons than you do actually seeing the good the money does. I met Ellis when I was 29, at a board networking dinner. He was the kind of man who talked like a CEO even though he wasn't one. Clean lines. Pressed shirts. Smart words and a voice that sounded more important than the things he said. We got married within a year. At the time, it felt like being chosen. That mattered to me, more than I'd like to admit now. I grew up believing that being chosen, for a job, a role, a relationship, was a form of proof that you were enough. Ellis was a man of routine and appearances. He liked things to look good, sound right, feel impressive. He loved telling people he was married to someone compassionate, especially when I started volunteering part-time at a shelter for displaced children. But he never asked about the work. Never met the kids. Never even remembered the name of the shelter. That's where I met May. She was 6, maybe 7, but looked younger. Quiet in that deep, soul-worn kind of way, like life had already done more to her than it should have. The first time I saw her, she was sitting on the edge of a plastic chair, arms wrapped around herself, eyes tracking every adult in the room like they were threats. She didn't speak to anyone. But she let me sit beside her. Week after week, I went back. She started to let me read to her. Then she let me brush her hair. One day, she fell asleep on my shoulder while we waited for her intake counselor. And something shifted in me. I didn't say it out loud at first, but I knew. She was mine. Not biologically, not legally, but in the way your soul tells you when something is yours to protect. I brought it up to Ellis once. Lightly. Carefully. A what if, spoken between sips of wine while he scrolled through work emails. He didn't even look up. We've talked about this. It's not the right time. It's probably never going to be. That was it. Discussion over. I didn't push. Instead, I started asking questions on my own. Quietly. What the process looked like. What it would mean. What the requirements were. I kept a folder. Notes. A timeline. Then one day, May's social worker pulled me aside. Her placement options had fallen through. There was an opening, a rare one, for emergency pre-adoptive foster care. But someone had to file. Quickly. I didn't go home to ask Ellis. I went to the courthouse. And I filed. 2 weeks later was the charity gala. One of those polished events where people who barely donate enough to matter still wear tuxedos and talk about making a difference while sipping $1,000 champagne. Ellis was in his element. He knew everyone by name, shook hands with practiced ease, and smiled for photos like it was muscle memory. I spent the first hour pretending. Pretending I wasn't hiding a truth so big it pulsed in my chest like a second heartbeat. I waited until we were alone. He was leaning against the balcony railing, talking to someone from a tech firm he'd been trying to network with. I asked for a moment. He followed me into a side corridor, quiet, echoey, lined with sculptures and dim lighting. I handed him the folder. His eyes flicked across the front page. Then the second. Then he looked at me. You filed for adoption? I nodded. My throat was dry. You filed adoption papers behind my back? He raised his voice, just slightly, but enough for it to carry. You're serious? She's a child who needs someone, I said. I want to be that someone. He didn't even blink. Just scoffed, loud, unbothered. You're pathetic for needing a kid to feel important. Then he turned around and walked right back through the ballroom, through the guests, the donors, the catered hors d'oeuvres, and out the front doors. I stood there. For longer than I should have. I wanted to cry. Not because of what he said, but because I'd spent so long hoping he'd be someone he never actually was. I got home before he did. The house felt too big, like it echoed. I sat at the kitchen table, stared at the second plate I'd set out like a fool, and thought about how many years I had spent trying to fill the silence between us with hope. Then I got up. I took the key from the drawer and opened the hallway closet, the one where I had quietly started keeping May's things. The backpack she liked. The little stuffed rabbit she clutched at night. A framed photo of us from the shelter's spring picnic. I set it all out. Then I moved the rest of my clothes into the spare bedroom. Called my lawyer. Confirmed the lease on the apartment in Bon Air, the one I had already signed in case things went exactly like this. When Ellis walked through the door sometime around midnight, the first thing he saw was the backpack. Then the photo. Then me, standing calmly at the kitchen counter. He froze. "What's this?" "It's home," I said simply. "Just not for you anymore." His face went pale. Not angry, just stunned. Like he hadn't expected the consequences to be real. Like I was supposed to still be waiting for him to understand. But I wasn't waiting anymore. He asked if I was serious. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, like the truth hadn't fully landed yet. Like he was still catching up to the reality that I wasn't bluffing. I had no tears left to give him, no performances of sadness for his benefit. I wasn't trying to hurt him, that would have required energy I no longer cared to spend. I was simply done. Ellis looked around like he was trying to find proof that I hadn't really gone through with it. Maybe he thought I'd be sleeping on the couch or waiting for him to apologize. But I had moved my things out of the bedroom earlier that day. My closet was empty. The drawers were cleared. My scent was gone from the pillowcases. I had taken myself out of that space, not as a punishment to him, but as an act of rescue for myself. "Rena," he said eventually, voice low, almost like he was trying not to wake something up. "This is crazy. You can't just do this." I didn't respond. I picked up the folder from the table, the one with the adoption documents, and handed it to him again, calmly this time. "You didn't care enough to understand this before. So here it is. If you're going to be angry, at least know what you're angry about." He didn't take it. Instead, he stood there, expression somewhere between disbelief and indignation, and watched as I walked past him. That night, I didn't sleep in that house. I drove to the apartment in Bon Air, even though I hadn't moved everything in yet. I had a spare set of keys, a mattress on the floor, and 2 duffel bags. May's framed photo sat on the windowsill like a lighthouse. I curled up with her stuffed rabbit beside me. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. Ellis tried to reassert control the next day. He emailed me a formal notice, typed and signed, full of legal buzzwords, telling me I had no authority to pursue an adoption without his written consent. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who called it what it was, a scare tactic from someone who knew he'd lost control. She called him a paper lion. Loud on the surface, but hollow underneath. I filed for legal separation the following Monday. He didn't show up to our first mediation session. Sent a paralegal in his place with a stack of demands that didn't make sense, requests for furniture we'd never owned, claims about emotional damages from my decision to leave, and a petty list of expenses that included things like replacement cost of joint dinner parties. I remember reading that line out loud to Drusilla, my lawyer, and we both just stared at each other in silence before laughing. He still didn't ask about May. Not once. Not why. Not how. Not who she was. It was always about him. His reputation. His comfort. His ego. What he didn't know was that I had started documenting everything, every message, every missed meeting, every time he tried to exert pressure without actual follow-through. He didn't have a leg to stand on, and I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The apartment in Bon Air became home faster than I expected. It was smaller, sure. A bit drafty in the winter. But it was filled with warmth I hadn't felt in years. May adjusted slowly, cautiously, like someone who'd learned not to get too comfortable. But one night, about a month after she moved in, I found her asleep on the couch with a book open in her lap and her rabbit tucked under her arm. That image nearly broke me. Because it was so normal. And I realized how deeply I had craved a version of life that was built on small, quiet joy. We started building routines. Grocery trips together. Homework on the kitchen table. Movie nights with popcorn that never quite popped all the way. I started waking up looking forward to things again. It was new. It was light. But of course, Ellis wasn't finished. Not yet. One day, I got a letter. Not an email, not a phone call, a letter. Mailed. Formal. The envelope was stiff, the kind used for business proposals or contracts. It was from his attorney. He was trying to initiate a claim, not for custody, but to petition the court for legal input on any decisions impacting joint property or household responsibilities prior to dissolution. In plain terms? He was trying to insert himself into the adoption process. But here's the thing, the paperwork I filed for May's guardianship and eventual adoption had already cleared the critical thresholds. He hadn't been listed because I had filed individually, citing emotional abandonment, lack of involvement in any family planning or child-rearing discussions, and the legal precedent of separate financial accounts and independent community contributions. My lawyer filed a rebuttal so precise, so well-supported, that it read more like a memoir than a legal defense. We attached emails from Ellis refusing to discuss children. Screenshots of his behavior at the gala. Statements from shelter staff confirming his absence and lack of involvement. And then, we included a character affidavit from May's social worker. It was short, just a page and a half, but it said everything it needed to. May has begun to smile. May eats full meals now. May asks to go home, not to a place, but to Rena. That document hit like truth often does, quietly, but with no room left to argue. Ellis withdrew the claim 2 weeks later. I started seeing him less and less. The house in Richmond went quiet. A neighbor texted me once to say they'd seen him yelling at a delivery man in the driveway over a misplaced package. Another time, someone told me he'd shown up to a charity brunch, alone, disheveled, oddly quiet, and left before the food was even served. He wasn't the same anymore. Or maybe, finally, he was exactly who he'd always been. But now the room was too quiet for anyone not to notice. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't post cryptic quotes online or stage public wins for social media. I just kept building a life for May and me, one morning at a time. Every so often, I'd open a drawer and find something from my old life, a necklace from one of our early anniversaries, a candle from a trip we took to Asheville, a wine opener we never used. I didn't throw them out. I just put them in a box marked before. May and I made a new box. We called it Now. Inside it, movie ticket stubs, her first report card, a paper heart she made that said "You're my safe." She gave it to me on a Tuesday. I didn't cry. I just held her hand. And held on to everything that came after the storm. The last time Ellis and I were in the same room was neither planned nor dramatic. It was a fundraiser at the university downtown, one of those events where everyone's name tag was just a slightly different version of the same resume. I was there on behalf of the nonprofit I'd started working with, a quiet partnership helping young women who had aged out of the foster system find stable housing and job training. I wasn't a guest. I was staff. Greeter. Logistics. The behind-the-scenes part, the kind I actually preferred. Ellis wasn't on the guest list. But of course, someone like him didn't need to RSVP. He strolled in halfway through, flashing that polished grin, hand already extended to shake someone's, sliding right back into the world of appearances like he hadn't dropped out of it for almost a year. He hadn't seen me yet. I don't think he expected to. But the moment his eyes landed on me, standing behind the sign-in table, hair tied up, wearing flats and a staff badge, he stopped mid-step. It was so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did. The flicker in his face, the tightening of his jaw, the way he swallowed without drinking anything. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just looked at him the way you look at a stranger who seems familiar but doesn't belong where you are anymore. He walked toward me anyway. Of course he did. He stood across the table and said my name like it was something he had permission to use. Rena. I let a beat pass. Ellis. He looked around, probably expecting me to shrink into the background or explain why I was working the event and not attending it. When I didn't, he tried a different tactic. You look different. I raised an eyebrow. Good different or forgettable different? He gave a short, awkward laugh. Just different. He looked down at the name tags. Tapped the corner of the table. I could see him struggling to find footing, to insert himself into the version of my life he'd been shut out of. I heard, he said after a moment. About the adoption. About May. He said her name like it tasted unfamiliar in his mouth. She's doing well, I said. She's thriving. He nodded once. That's good. Another silence stretched out, thick and awkward. Then he said, I didn't think you'd really go through with all of it. There it was. The sentence that told me everything I had always suspected, that he had banked on me bending. That his power over me had always rested on the assumption that I needed his approval to move. I stood straighter. Not to impress. Just to own the space I was standing in. You never thought I'd leave, I said. You never thought I'd start over. You never thought I'd find something more meaningful than your opinion of me. He didn't deny it. He just blinked, like he'd swallowed something bitter and couldn't spit it out. Before he could respond, someone called my name from across the room. A donor who had questions about the seating chart. I turned to go, then paused. I have to get back to work, I said. But thank you. His eyebrows lifted. For what? For walking away that night. You made the decision really easy. I didn't wait for him to respond. I walked away. Back at home that night, May was on the living room rug, surrounded by crayons and glitter glue, humming softly as she worked on a school project. The apartment smelled like slow-cooked lentils and cinnamon, two scents that didn't go together, but somehow made the place feel like us. I sat beside her and asked how her day was. She told me about a girl in her class who lost a tooth and about the game they played in gym. Then she looked at me, serious all of a sudden. Did you have a good day, Mama? I nodded. Did anything bad happen? No, I said. Someone from before showed up. But it didn't matter. She leaned her head on my arm, then kept coloring. That was it. No fanfare. No thunderclap moment. Just peace. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. I still had some things to unpack, not physical boxes, but the kinds of truths you don't fully realize until you're on the other side of surviving. Things like how long I'd accepted breadcrumbs and called it love. How many times I'd apologized for wanting more than being tolerated. How often I'd confused endurance for strength. But none of it had power over me anymore. Not now. May was growing. I was healing. And the life we were building was real. Quiet. Steady. Ours. The day the adoption was finalized didn't feel the way I thought it would. I had imagined a big rush of emotion, tears, celebration, maybe even an Instagram-worthy photo with a caption about beginnings. But instead, it felt calm. Quiet. Like the moment you finally exhale after holding your breath for too long and forgetting you were doing it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. May sat beside me, her legs swinging off the edge of the seat, wearing a yellow dress she picked herself and a clip in her hair that she insisted was shaped like a sunflower, even though it looked more like a squashed daisy. She squeezed my hand the entire time, and I squeezed back like a promise. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes and a tone that didn't try to be overly cheerful, read through the final papers and asked me the questions she was required to ask. Was I prepared for full responsibility? Had I been her guardian in practice already? Did I understand what this commitment meant? I said yes to everything. Then she looked at May and asked if she was happy with me. May nodded quickly, like the question didn't even need thinking. That was it. A signature. A few official words. And then, just like that, May became my daughter, legally, permanently, without any shadow of dispute. Ellis hadn't contested. His attempt to involve himself had failed so swiftly and publicly that I suspected even he realized how empty his reach had become. He sent no letters. No more legal notices. Nothing. It was as if he finally accepted what I had known the night he walked out of that gala. He was no longer part of my story. After the hearing, May and I went for ice cream. Not because it was a big celebration, but because it was Wednesday and sunny and she liked mint chocolate chip. We sat on a park bench near the James River, just a few blocks from our apartment, and she leaned into me while we ate. "Does this mean I get to stay forever?" she asked, eyes wide. I kissed her forehead. "You always did." That night, she fell asleep with her arms wrapped around her pillow and the stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. I watched her for a long time. Not because I was worried, but because I was grateful. Because for the first time in so many years, I wasn't standing on uncertain ground. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop or for someone to shift the terms of my happiness. I had built something that no one could take from me. Our apartment, small, lived in, cluttered with art supplies and mismatched furniture, had become something sacred. Not because of its size or location, but because of the love that lived in it. The walls weren't echoes anymore. They held laughter. Conversation. The occasional off-key singing. I started writing again. Just privately, at first. Bits and pieces of my story, things I hadn't told anyone. Notes about how I lost myself in my marriage without realizing it, and how I found myself again in a child who didn't ask for anything except safety. I thought maybe one day I'd turn it into something. A blog. A book. I didn't know yet. But it felt good to remember that I still had a voice. I still kept a small box marked before. I didn't look at it often, but I didn't throw it away either. Not because I missed any of it, but because it reminded me what I'd survived. Inside were things that once meant something, a photo from the early days, a bracelet from our honeymoon in Santa Fe, a note Ellis wrote me after a fight saying he was trying. It wasn't dramatic. Just pieces of a life I used to live. The real box, though, was the one May kept on her nightstand. The now box. Inside, glitter-covered cards, a rock she said looked like a turtle, a dried flower from the park, and a drawing of the two of us in front of a lopsided house with a big red heart over the roof. The drawing wasn't perfect. But the heart? That was dead center. And that was what mattered. I didn't need applause. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not to Ellis. Not to the world. And most importantly, not to myself. The legal dissolution of the marriage happened just 6 weeks after May's adoption was finalized. Clean, uncontested, done with barely a word exchanged. It had taken over a year from the moment I walked away to the moment the court stamped the decree. But it felt like closing the cover of a book I'd long since finished reading. Drusilla, my lawyer, called me after the final court appearance, which I didn't even need to attend, and said, "It's over, Rena. Officially. You're free." And I was. Officially. No more papers. No more shared accounts. No more legal tether tying me to a man who had once defined so much of my life, only to end up as a cautionary tale. The finality didn't feel like a crash. It was more like waking up in a quiet room after a long, restless sleep. I sat in the kitchen that night, our kitchen, sipping tea while May painted a shoebox to look like a treasure chest. She told me she wanted to fill it with only happy things. Nothing from the before? I asked gently. Nope, she said, not even looking up. Only the now stuff. And later stuff. Smart kid. Ellis resurfaced one last time. He emailed me a month after the divorce was finalized, just a few lines, written in that clipped tone of his, like he was dictating instructions for an assistant. He asked to meet. No subject line. No context. Just, it would mean a lot to speak. Just once. I didn't reply. He followed it up with a second message 2 days later. I know I made mistakes. I want to apologize properly. Please. Still, I didn't reply. Then came the third, longer. More emotional. This one, unlike the others, had a distinct thread of desperation. He wrote about misunderstandings, about how he'd been going to therapy, and how he was reassessing everything. He ended the message with, "Maybe I didn't understand what you were offering until it was gone." That line stuck with me. Not because it stirred anything, but because it confirmed everything. He didn't understand. He never had. And by the time he wanted to, there was nothing left for him to learn from me. Still, I wrote a letter. Not for him. For me. I didn't send it. I never intended to. But I wrote it out, every last word, in a quiet moment after May had gone to bed. Just me, a mug of tea, and the hum of the city outside our window. Dear Ellis, you say you want to talk. That you understand now. That you've changed. Here's the thing, I believe you may have changed. I truly hope you have. But the woman you remember, the one who made herself small in exchange for peace, who walked on eggshells and called it partnership, she's not here anymore. And she's not coming back. You didn't lose me because I needed a child to feel important. You lost me because I realized I was important without you. I wish you clarity. I wish you growth. But I don't wish you back into my life. Rena, I folded the letter and put it in the before box. Then I took that box, with its fading memories, dusty keepsakes, and folded pain, and slid it to the back of the top shelf in the hall closet. Not gone. Not destroyed. Just out of sight. The satisfying part of all this isn't that Ellis lost. It's that I stopped losing. Every day, every small choice that used to drain me, every dismissal, every cold shoulder, every twisted comment passed off as wit, I reclaimed those spaces. Not with drama. Not with revenge in the way people imagine it, shouting matches, lawsuits, public takedowns. But with peace. With proof. With purpose. May and I were featured in a local news segment 6 months later. It was part of a story on families formed through adoption and the growing need for permanent homes for kids in foster care. They filmed us baking cookies, something we did every Friday, and May insisted on wearing her chef hat with glitter letters spelling Captain Cookie. When the story aired, messages poured in. Friends, old classmates, even strangers. Some recognized me. A few recognized Ellis's last name and connected the dots. But I didn't explain. I didn't owe anyone the backstory. My life wasn't a rebuttal to his anymore. It was its own headline. One afternoon, nearly a year after our final exchange, I ran into one of Ellis's former colleagues. We were in line at a bookstore downtown. He looked at me, smiled politely, then said, "Hey, I used to work with your ex Ellis, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, that was a while ago." He gave an awkward shrug. "We haven't seen much of him lately." "I think things changed." "Things tend to," I said. He glanced at May, who was standing a few steps away flipping through a children's book, her pink backpack hanging off one shoulder. "You look good, Rena." "Happier." "I am," I said simply. And that was it. The moment I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. Not to him. Not to anyone. The truth was in the life I lived now, steady, full, rooted. Our days settled into rhythms. School drop-offs, grocery runs, bedtime stories, mismatched socks, and glitter on every surface. May filled our home with drawings, noise, and a joy that didn't ask permission. I hosted a small adoption day anniversary celebration, just a few friends, a homemade cake, and paper crowns. May made one for me too. She colored it gold, glued on a plastic gem, and wrote Queen Mama across the front. It was crooked. It was perfect. She handed it to me and said, "You're the best kind of mama." I bent down, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You're the best kind of everything." I never saw Ellis again after that bookstore encounter. Never heard from him. He faded, not because I erased him, but because I stopped feeding the memory. He got the life he created. And I got the one I chose. Without destruction. Without screaming.